Welcome to PseudoPod, the weekly horror podcast. We're here to scare and entertain you, so if we're only scaring you, then please bail out the episode. We won't mind, and another one will be along next week, promise.
PseudoPod, episode 957, for January 10th, 2025. Dead Mabelle, by Elizabeth Bowen. Narrated by Layla Al-Jabori, hosted by Kat Day, audio by Chelsea Davis. Hey everyone, Happy New Year from me. Hope you're all doing okay and enjoying the apparently never-ending January days. I'm Kat, assistant editor at PseudoPod, your host for this week, and I'm excited to tell you that for this week we have Dead Mabelle by Elizabeth Bowen. This story first appeared in the 1929 collection Joining Charles and Other Stories. Elizabeth Bowen, CBE, was an Anglo-Irish writer, notable for her books about the big house of Irish landed Protestants, as well as her fiction about life in wartime London. In 1958, she was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature. Her final novel, Eva Trout, or Changing Scenes, won the James Tate Black Memorial Prize in 1969 and was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 1970. Layla is an actor and writer from London. It's unlikely you've seen her in anything unless you happen to not blink during a particular episode of Silent Witness about 8 years ago. Layla is currently in a children's theatre show called Kidocracy, which goes to school and teaches kids about democracy. So we should hopefully have a decent government in 20 to 30 years' time. When she's not training up the next generation, Layla can usually be found shouting at her kitchen utensil drawers and asking her daughter to put her shoes on. As a parent of 2 daughters myself, oh yes. Now, before we collect our popcorn and push open the door of the abandoned movie theatre to peer into the shadows of today's story, 2 things. Firstly, this story alludes to, although does not contain, suicide. If that's going to be tough for you, you might want to give this one a miss. We'll be back next week, we promise. Secondly, as I said a moment ago, this story was originally published in 1929. At that time, the idea of film projected for an audience was only some 30 years old. Most films, or movies for my American friends, still lacked speech, the first talkie having only premiered in 1927. And they were, of course, black and white. Colour film did exist in very early forms, but colour photos and film wouldn't begin to reach the mainstream for at least another 20 years. All of which is to say that the idea of a celebrity film star was pretty new, if not an entirely unfamiliar concept to many people. So, I invite you to imagine yourself in that time. And now, we have a story for you. And we promise you, it's true.
Dead Mabelle, by Elizabeth Bowen. Narrated by Layla Al-Jabori. The sudden and horrible end of Mabel Pacey gave her a publicity with the European press worth millions to J&Z Gohai of Gohai Films Incorporated, California, USA. Her personality flashed like a fused wire. 3-year-old films of Mabel, with scimitar curves of hair waxed forward against the cheeks, in the quaint creations of 1924, were recalled by the lesser London and greater provincial cinemas. The Mary Magdalene, Mabel with no hair to speak of, in a dinner jacket, was retained for weeks by the Acropolis and the Albany, wide porticoed palaces of the West End. Managers of the next order negotiated it for recklessly, and thousands had to be turned away during its briefer appearances in Edinburgh, Dublin and Manchester. The release of her last, Purblind, was awaited breathlessly. Her last, when brimming with delighted horror, horrified delight, with a sense of foreknowledge, as though time were being unwound from the reel backwards. One would see all Mabel's unconsciousness under the sending claw of horror. Nothing she'd ever mimicked could approach the end that had overtaken her. It was to be this film, a feast for the Epicurean sensation. One would watch the lips smile, the gestures ripple out from brain to fingertips, It was on her return from the studio at the end of the making of this very picture that she had perished so appallingly. The management of the Bijou Picturedome at Pamsley considered themselves fortunate in having secured The White Rider, a 1923 production. Since dusk, on a framework erected above the facade of the Picturedome, green electricity scrawled Mabel in the rainy sky. She was with them for 3 nights only. The habitués streamed in. Uncertain patrons, pausing under her superscription, thumbed the edge of a florin, looked up and down the street, and when the metal ticket finally clicked out, dived still 2/3 reluctant into the stifling tunnel of tobacco fumes and plush. From 5:30, for half an hour before the first showing, the entrance curtain never settled down into stillness. At 8:30, another rush began. William Stickford's afternoon at the bank went by distractedly. He was intelligent, solitary, self-educated, self-suspicious. He had read without system enough to trouble him endlessly. Textbooks picked up at random, popular translations, fortnightly publications, scientific and so on, complete in so many parts. Potted history and philosophy all the time. On walks alone or lying awake in the dark, he would speculate as to the nature of reality. What am I? But am I? If I am, what else is? If I'm not, is anything else? Is anything? He would start awake, sweating from a nightmare of something that felt like an empty barrel rolling over the ups and downs in his brain and bumping into craters that were the craters of the moon, or of going round to the house where he lived to pay a surprise call on himself and being sent away with a headshake, told point blank he had never been heard of here. Sometimes, an idle but anguishing sport of the mind, he told himself he was the victim of some practical joke on the scale of the universe, of which everybody and everything, from the stars and the manager to the pipe cleaners, tooth soap and bootlaces fringing his existence, were linked in furtive enjoyment. He never went with a girl. His landlady deplored this. To do so, she said, would make him more natural-like. She liked a young fellow to be a young fellow, and William apparently wasn't. His manager, a kind, unperceptive old man who believed in the personal touch, asked him up for a musical evening to meet his nieces. But William achieved being shy and aggressive, looking askance around the side of his glasses, snubbed the nieces and couldn't relax with the manager. The girls discouraged their uncle from asking him home again. A fellow at the bank called Jim Bartlett succeeded in knowing him up to a point. He couldn't quite get Jim into focus, but he supposed he liked him all right. Jim would force his way in of an evening, pour his books with a snigger of admiration, and sit with his feet on the fender and the soles of his boots steaming till 12 o'clock, till one's brain went stiff and dry. Theoretically, William needn't have listened, but he did listen. Other existences tugged at him with their awful, never dismissible, never disposable of possibility, probability even. Sometimes Jim forced him out. William was cinema-shy. He resisted the cinema till a man with important-looking initials mentioned it in a weekly review as an art form. Then he went there with Jim and saw Mabel. "I can't think," Jim had said that first evening, impatiently gathering up his change at the box office, "how a lot of this girl's stuff ever gets past the censor." William expected Mabel's appeal to be erotic and went in armoured with intellectuality. But it was not erotic. That he could see. The film had begun. With a startled feeling, he walked down the tilted gangway towards Mabel's face and the dark and light glittering leaves behind. A caption, "Can you believe me?" Then a close-up. Mabel's face jumped forward at him. He stepped back on Jim's toe and stared at a moon-shaped white light in an eye, expecting to see himself reflected. He stood for a moment, feeling embraced in her vision. "Confound you," said Jim, and pushed him sharp to the left. They waded through to their places. William sat down shaken and put up a hand to his eyes. "It's beastly jumpy," he said. "I always heard they were jumpy." "You get used to them. Gosh, what a lovely girl, isn't she? Look at that, old man, look at that for a figure." It had all been very abstract. He recognised it in some hinterland of his brain. He understood that passion and purity, courage, deception and lust were being depicted and sat there without curiosity, watching Mabel. That was some 5 months ago, before her death. She had long been known to the connoisseur, but her real vogue was only then beginning. She had an unusual way with her. Qualities overlapped strangely in that black and white world of abstractions she alone moved in a blur. Each moment, in unexpected relation to movements. Each movement, in unexpected relation to movements preceding it, outraged a preconception. William sat with an angry, disordered feeling as though she were a rising flood in his mind bulrushes. She had a slow, almost diffident precision of movement. She got up, sat down, put out a hand, smiled, with a sparklingly mournful air of finality, as though she were committing herself. And every time William wanted to rise in his seat and say, Don't, not before all these people. Her underlids were straight. She'd lean back her head and look over them. Her upper lids arched to a point. She had 3-cornered eyes. When her face went into repose, the lids came down slowly, hiding her eyes for moments together. When she looked up again, that dark, dancing, direct look came out, as if it were from hiding, taking one unawares. It was as though she leaned forward and touched one. William, who suffered throughout from a feeling of being detained where he had no business, was glad when the film was over. He said on the way home, "She's awfully different from what I expected, I must say." Jim Bartlett responded, "Uh-huh." He kept saying, "Aha," with an infinite archness and refusing to volunteer much about Mabel himself. "She's got a temperament," was the most William got out of him. "You know what I mean. Temperament. Jolly rare thing. She ought to play Irish Storm in the Green Hat." That night it was William who wanted to bring Jim in and keep him talking. Not that Jim's ineptitudes were any more tolerable, but he had a feeling of someone at home in him, in possession, very assured in the darkness, mutually and sardonically waiting till he was alone. A week or so later, he saw in the local paper that The Fall, featuring Mabel, was showing at Belton, 10 miles off. Eluding Jim, he bicycled that same evening over to Belton. He pedalled furiously, mounting the steep, sleek high road over the ridge, his brain a cold clamour of self-curiosity. Enlightened shamefully, burning, he bicycled home in the teeth of an icy wind. Next morning, cornered by Jim's 2 pressing inquiries, he lied as to where he'd been. It had been Jim's fault. He shouldn't have asked him. Thought, as he understood thought, became pale and meaningless, reading scarcely more than a titillation of the eyeballs. Lapses appeared in his work. He was submerged by uneasiness, alternately, as it were, straining after a footfall and slamming a door. There was this thing about Mabel, the way she made love. She was tired, oh, fearfully tired. Her forehead dropped down on a man's shoulder. Her body went slack. There seemed no more hope for her than a tree in a hurricane. When her head fell back in despair, while the man devoured her face horribly, one watched her forgotten arm hang down over his shoulder. The tips of the fingers twitched. What was she thinking about? What did women think about then? One night, Jim Bartlett, rooting among William's possessions, pulled out the picture-goer from between some books on the wall. On the cover, Mabel, full length, stood looking sideways, surprised and ironical, elegantly choked by a hunting stock, hair ruffled up as though she just pulled a hat off, hand holding bunched-up gauntlets prompt on it. On the cover, Mabel, full length, stood looking sideways, surprised and ironical, elegantly choked by a hunting stock, hair ruffled up as though she just pulled a hat off, hand holding bunched-up gauntlets propped on a hip. Jim, shocked into impassivity, stared at the photograph. His pipe sticking out at an angle from his expressionless face reminded William of a pipe stuck into a snowman. "Pretty photograph, isn't it?" said William aggressively, to shatter the bulging silence. Jim removed his pipe thoughtfully. "'Pon my word," he began. "Upon my word. You really are, you know. I mean really, old man. I got it for you, as a matter of fact. If you hadn't gone messing about, I'd have—" "Oh, said Jim. "We don't think." "No, don't think." "Then don't think. And damn you, get out." They were always very polite to each other at the bank. There was little coarse talk or swearing. Jim Bartlett was very shocked and went home. Next morning, William apologised. "Say nothing more about it, old man," said Jim nicely. "I quite understand. Beg yours, I'm sure. If I had any idea you were going to take it like that." Good feeling made him perfectly goggle-eyed. He came round punctually that same evening to hear all about it. William was out. He remained out till 11:30. He did this 3 evenings successively, avoiding Jim at the bank, and after that Jim didn't come any more. If William had been open and manly about the business, as pal to pal, Jim Bartlett would have been discretion himself. As it was, in the course of events, he told all the other fellows. They told the manager's nieces, who told the manager. The manager soon had occasion to speak to William seriously about the work and excessive cinema-going. This concentration of interest upon him, of derision, hardened him outwardly, heightened his sensibility. He avoided the Bijou at Pamsley, the Electra at Belton, but took excursion tickets to London and saw Mabelle there. Expeditions to the remoter suburbs were often necessary. He'd sup or take tea dazedly in gaslit pastry cooks and wander between showings of the film through anonymous vacant streets. Life all these months rushed by him while he stood still. William never looked at the newspaper before lunchtime. Others did. One morning, coming to the bank, he was aware of a tension, of a scared, shy greediness in the others' faces, of being glanced at and glanced across. Jim Bartlett came up once or twice, looked strangely, flinched off, cleared his throat and kept on beginning, "I say." "What's up?" snapped out William, exasperated by what seemed a new form of persecution. "Nothing much. Seen the paper?" "No." Jim Bartlett, driven and urgent, fidgeted round in a semicircle under the blank and intense glare of William's glasses. "There's something. Look, come to dinner." "Oh, thanks, I don't think so," said William in the consequential, sleek little voice it assumed. Jim tugged at the lobe of a crimson ear, helplessly, shrugged a "so be it," and went off. In his sitting room, the Daily Mail was propped against William's water jug. Mabel's name blazed, put over the centre column, with fearful death. With a sudden stillness, with a feeling of awful extended leisure, William put out his hand for the paper. While he read, he kept putting his hand up and touching his throat. Each time he did this, he started as though he had touched someone else, or someone else had touched him. He read carefully down to the end of the column, looked over the top of the paper, and saw his chop slowly congealing behind it. He ran from the room and was violently sick. When this was over, he took up the paper again, but he couldn't read well. The lines bulged and dipped. He waited a little to see if he was going to be sick any more, then went out and bought all the other papers. Coming out of the newsagent's, he met the wind tearing down the street. He stood on the curbstone, not knowing which way to go. The wind got into the papers and rattled and sang in them. They gave out an inconceivable volume of sound to which he believed the whole town must turn round and listen. He looked this way and that, then pressing the papers against him, ran across the street and went into the church. Here he read all the other versions. Physical detail abounded. He sat for a long time, crushed up to a wall in the gloom of a pew, then went back to the bank. 5 weeks later, the White Rider, featuring Mabelle Pacey, came to Pamsley. "Going?" said Jim to William, who seemed to have got over things wonderfully well. "Oh, I don't know," said William. "I've some work on at home." He was doing one of those correspondence courses. "I don't know that I've got the time." On Monday and Tuesday, he did not go to the Picturedrome. He disappeared utterly. No one knew where he'd gone. The last day of Mabelle was Wednesday. Wednesday came. The afternoon at the bank went by, then, distractedly. Rain fell past the tall windows, blurring the outlook. The trickle and stutter of drops racked the nerves. With dread, William looked up at the clock again and again, uneager as never before for release, half hoping by some resolution, some obduracy, to staunch the bleeding away of the minutes. The door to the back passage was open for some minutes. William kept looking away from it, and while he was looking away, Mabelle stood there, leaning a shoulder against the lintel, smiling and swinging a gauntlet. She was confident he'd be there tonight. He faced round to the empty doorway. Mightn't she as well be there, who wasn't anywhere, who was not? She was incapable now of confidence, of a smile, of pressure against the lintel. He had faced for these last weeks her absolute disillusion. At that reiteration, in his mind, in the doorway, of emptiness, he must have made some movement or sound, for the others looked up from their ledgers. William coughed and showed himself, as in some agony of calculation. The faces dropped. The afternoon dwindled out. The office shrank in the dusk and began to be crowded with shadows. Somebody climbed on a chair with a taper. The gas coughed a light, and the rain sliding and streaming down the window panes scintillated against the thickening night. Woven securely into the room's industrious pattern, William rested. But now the pattern was torn up violently into shreds of clamour and movement. They all went home. William lingered over his leisure a long time, but was finally drawn out after them. At 8:10, he was pushing against the Bijou's interior curtain. Its voluminousness, a world of plush, for some moments quenched and smothered him. A prickly contact to hands and face, exhaling a warm dankness. The attendant fought him out, taking away his ticket. Standing room only. He grudged her a little triumph. He'd been told that outside. He chose a place along the transverse gangway, and gripped with hands still pricking from the plush a cold brass rail behind the expensive seats. He looked down a long perspective, a flickering arcade of shadow. For 20 seconds or so there was no one. The trees' fretful movements, the dazzlingly white breaking through of the sky. The orchestra wound off their tune with a flourish and sharply, more noticeably, was silent down in their red-lighted pit. The flutter and click of machinery streamed out across the theatre, like the terrified wings of a bird imprisoned between two window panes. It gave him the same stretched-out sensation of horror and helplessness. A foreign whiteness, a figure, more than a figure, appeared. A white-coated girl on a white horse drawn sideways across the distant end of the drive. She listened, all tense, to that same urgent flutter and clicking, then wheeled the horse round and dashed forward into the audience, shadows streaming over her. William recoiled from the horse's great hammerhead, the hoofs dangerous as bells, the flick of the eyeballs. He looked up with a wrench at his being, advancing enormously, grinning a little at the moment's intensity. Mabel looked down. They encountered. Visibly thundering, horse and rider darkened the screen. Gripping the bar tight, William leaned back to look up at the bright, broadening shaft from the engine room, directed forward above him. Along this, fluid with her personality, Mabel, who was now nothing, streamed out from reel to screen, thence rebounded to his perception. It was all, her intense aliveness, some quivering motes which a hand put out with an intention would be able to intercept. The picture changed focus, receded. Mabel, in better perspective, slipped from her horse and stood panting and listening. The horse turned its head, listened too. Their sympathy, their physical fineness, sent a quiver across the audience. In protest, a burst of assertion, the music began again. Tum-tirity-tum, tum-ta-rum-ti-too, rum-ti-too. Mabel tied her horse to a tree and turned off cautiously into the forest. The man was there in a glade, that man she generally acted with, whom one had a dozen times watched her make herself over to, her recurring lover. He stood with his back to a tree, with a grin of certainty, waiting for her. However much he might repel at the outset, however craven, false or overtly lustful he might show himself, he had her ultimately. He had to have her every film. She liked her men fallible, evidently, unsympathetic to audiences, subject to untimely spasms of passion. It brought out all her coolness, her lovely desperation, her debonair fatedness. Her producer kept this well in mind. With unavailing wariness she now came stepping with her white-breeched legs, the light glancing off her riding boots, high over the fallen trees, low under the overhanging branches. Shadows struck off her head again, and again. The man smiled, threw his cigarette away, stepped round his tree and closed with her. A poignant leap back. One was shown the white horse standing, tormented by intuition, tossing its head uneasily, twitching its ears. William had come late. The end was sooner than he expected. Mabel, in a black straight dress, in meekness and solitude, stood by a high stone mantel looking into a fire. The preceding caption was red, the light now tinged with a realistic redness. Flames, in leisurely anticipation of their triumph, spurted and leapt at her feet. The firelight fingered its way up her, crept around her arms' fine moulding. Her throat, her chin, with curbed greed, assurance, affection almost. She stood there, to the eyes of that 4 years later audience, dedicated, It was as though the fire knew. A log crashed in. She started, looked with appalled eyes away from the fire. She was waiting. She was too real, standing there, while more and more of her came travelling down the air. She seemed perpetual, untouchable. You couldn't break that stillness by the fire. It could shatter time. You might destroy the film, destroy the screen, destroy her body. This endured. She was beyond the compass of one's mind. One's being seemed a fragment and a shadow. Perished, dissolved in an agony too fearful to contemplate. Yet he had contemplated it, sucked meaning out of it till fact had nothing more to give. She returned to this imperishable quietness. Oh, Mabel. Somewhere a door opening. Light that lanced the darkness. Movement went through her like a swerve of a flame. She held her arms out. The illusion shattered. She was subject once again to destiny. William sharply turned with tight-shut eyes. He groped his way along the guiding bar. Was at fault a moment. Collided with the attendant looping back the curtain for the exodus. He went out slowly, into the glaring vestibule, down the 3 steps into the lit-up falling rain. Rain brushed his face. Drops here and there came through to the roots of his hair. He put his hat on, heard the drops, defeated, pattering on the brim. The street, unreal as that projected scene, was wide. He hesitated halfway across it, then slowly turned to the left. Behind, inside the open doors, he heard as if it were a wave break, a crash of freed movement, a rasping sigh. The band played the national anthem. Feasted with her, they all came streaming out, and she, released from their attention, dismissed, dispelled now. Where was she? His way home was at an angle from the high street, up a bypath. Water in the steep gutters hissed and gurgled. There were spaces of inky darkness. Here and there, some lamplight dimply caught a patch of humid wall. He looked back once, towards the town and the Picturedrome. One moment, Mabel was blazing emerald over the white facade. The next, the lights were out. Mabel. The doors beneath had disappeared. So she went. In another month or so, when her horror faded and her vogue had died, her films would be recalled. Boiled down, they said. He had heard old films were used for patent leather. That which was Mabel would be a shoe, a bag, a belt around some woman's middle. These sloughed off. What of her? You're here, he said, and put out a hand in the darkness. You know, I know you're here, you proud thing, standing and looking. Do you see me? You're more here than I. Going blindly, he passed within inches of a pair of lovers, plastered together speechlessly under the wall. A too urgent pressure had betrayed them by a creak of the mackintosh. Love. His exultation shuddered at the thought of such contact. Then for a moment, under the blight of that dismal embrace, he had lost her. Mabel. Mabel. Ah, here. Here, by him, burning into him with her actuality all the time. Burdening him with her realness. He paused again where a bicycle with lighted lamp had been leant up against some palings. The murky, dark yellow light streamed across the rain. Some ghostly chrysanthemums, drained of their pinks and yellows, raised up their heads in a clump in it, petals dishevelled and sodden. As he watched, one stem with its burden detached itself and swayed forward, dipped through the lamplight and vanished. He listened and heard the stem snap. How? Why? While the other stems stood up erect and unmoving, sustaining their burden. Who had... Oh, no, not that. He began to be terrified. Don't press me too hard, I can't stand it. I love you too much, Mabel. Look here, don't. He looked beyond the chrysanthemums, left and right, everywhere. She was there, left, right, everywhere, printed on the darkness. William, at home in his sitting room, walked about in a state of suspension, looking without connection of thought at his books and pictures. A clock struck 12. It was already tomorrow. This morning he'd be at the bank, back again in the everyday, no one the wiser. Now he could sleep a short time. Then life, that abstraction behind the business of living, was due to begin again. He was alive, enclosed in a body, in the needs of the body, tethered to functions. In the gaslight it looked rather shabby, this business of living. Greasy stains on the tablecloth where he'd slopped his dinner over the edge of his plate. Greasy rim around the inside of his hat where he'd sweated. This was how one impressed oneself of the material. And on the immaterial? Nothing. Comfortless. Perilous. More perishable than the brains in his skull even, showed his structure of thought. He had no power of being. Of feeling? Only that life was worth nothing because of Mabel, who was dead. And by death had he hoped that he wouldn't quench himself utterly while Mabel, who impinged herself everywhere, brightly burned on. The right-hand top drawer of his bureau was empty of what such a drawer should contain. The means to the only fit gesture that he could have offered her. He had jerked the drawer open with an unconscious parade of decision. An imitation, more piteously faithful than he was aware, of something which, witnessed again and again under the spell of that constant effusion from Mabel, had seemed conclusively splendid. The hand slipped, unfaltering to the back of the drawer. The gesture of pistol to temple, the trail of smoke fugitive over an empty screen. He was denied this exit. Under the stare, vaguely mocking, of three-cornered eyes, he bent down to study the notebooks, the bitten pencil stump, match ends, attempt at a sonnet, a tie, crumpled up and forgotten, that littered the drawer.
Well done. You've survived another story. What did you think of Dead Mabelle by Elizabeth Bowen? If you're a Patreon subscriber, we encourage you to pop over to our Discord channel and tell us. As I mentioned at the start of this episode, film and film stars were new concepts when Elizabeth Bowen was writing this story, and she certainly did not have the phrase parasocial relationship in her lexicon, although this idea is older than you might have thought, and more on this in a minute. But she describes the all-consuming obsession William develops for Mabelle, whom he doesn't know in any sort of real-life way, perfectly. So while to us in 2025 this may feel like a rather quiet piece about times gone by, then Bowen was, in a very real sense, writing a piece of horror science fiction. It's just that the science she was exploring was more psychological and social than shiny spaceships. I'm fairly sure that I heard the phrase parasocial relationship for the first time only a handful of years ago, and I suspect I'm not entirely alone, at least among people who haven't worked in the field of psychology. But the term was first formally described in relation to media figures in 1956. It became relevant then, of course, as media exposure grew ever greater and new teenagers pulled away from their parents' more conservative experiences of growing up. But it wasn't a wholly new idea even in the 1950s, or indeed in the 1920s, when Bowen was writing. Humans have always developed these kinds of unbalanced relationships with rulers, political figures, spirits, gods. Just sit with that thought for a moment. Gods. Begging the forgiveness of any listener with devout religious beliefs at this point, it is my opinion that no god created humans. No, humans create gods, and once upon a time gods were purely phantasmic beings. It didn't matter what stories we told, what we said they had or hadn't done, because they weren't about to turn up to tell us otherwise. They couldn't be hurt, and they certainly couldn't die. Gods aren't fallible. They can't let us down. The trouble is, then we invented media, and then social media. And now I fear it's all too easy to, without really thinking about what we're doing, give regular human beings who just happen to be very good at something, making music, acting, telling stories, godlike status. And they do let us down. They do leave us. They can't not. In this story, of course, Mabelle dies. We don't learn how, and that in itself is an interesting choice on Bowen's part, I suspect intentional, to preserve the mystery, the distance between William and the star he's come to idolise. But these days it's just as likely to be something less drastic than death. Whatever, the grief of the loss can be very real and very painful. Yes, our idols let us down, because they aren't gods. They're human beings. If I've learned anything in the last year, it's to remember this, to remember it hard, and keep remembering it. That face, that name, there's a human being behind all that. A flawed one, because all human beings are flawed. Hold on to that truth, and then perhaps it will be a little less horrifying when those flaws become visible. And this story doesn't really go into the other side of this. What happens in the mind of the single person projected 20 feet tall? Mostly because it's William's story, and also because how could Bowen possibly have imagined the way social media would connect fans and stars? No one could foresee that. But I think it would be remiss of me in the year of 2025 not to mention it. I fear it's incredibly hard to keep the idea that there are thousands, millions of people looking up to you reconciled with the idea that every single one of those people is a person. A real person with a life of their own, with a family, a job, dreams. I fear it's all too easy to start telling yourself those people are replaceable, disposable, not important, not even really real. And if that's true, it doesn't matter what you do, does it? It doesn't matter what lies you tell, how disdainful you are, what harm you cause. Those not really real people can't affect you. To start thinking of people as just, as in just fans, just the public, just employees. It's very bad in both directions, and we've all been warned not to think like this, not to idolise, not to dismiss, not to objectify. And yet I suspect we're all guilty of sometimes slipping into it in small yet dangerous ways. The superpower of humans, if only we can remember to use it, is empathy. Everyone is a person, messy, complicated, full of murky greys, and, yes, capable of growing and changing. Remind yourself of it often, hold it in your heart, cherish it. Here's to a peaceful 2025, everyone. Now, onto the subject of subscribing and support. PseudoPod is funded by you, our listeners, and we're formally a non-profit. One-time donations are gratefully received and much appreciated, but what really makes a difference is subscribing. A $5 monthly Patreon donation gives us more than just money. It gives us stability, reliability, dependability, and a well-maintained tower from which to operate. And trust us, you want that as much as we do. If you can, please go to pseudopod.org and sign up by clicking on Feed the Pod. If you have any questions about how to support EA and ways to give, please reach out to us at donations@escapeartists.net. And if you are thinking, ooh, New Year's resolution, I must go and sign up. Just one thing to remember, Apple have changed the way charging works through App Store apps. Long story short, sign up through a browser. It'll be cheaper, including if you use the browser actually on your phone. Just don't go through the app. This is just one of Apple's lovely quirks. And if you can't afford to support us financially, please consider leaving reviews of our episodes, or generally talking about them on whatever form of social media. Oh, there it is again, social media. You can't stay away from this week. Come and visit us on Blue Sky at pseudopod.org. If you like merch, you can also support us by buying various logoed goodies from the Escape Artists Void merch store. The link is in various places, including our latest social media posts. PseudoPod is part of the Escape Artist Foundation, a 501c3 non-profit, and this episode is distributed under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Download and listen to the episode on any device you like, but don't change it or sell it. Theme music is by permission of Anders Manka. Next week, we have The Shout by Robert Graves, narrated by Graham Dunlop and hosted by Alistair. And finally, PseudoPod and social worker and academic Brene Brown. No, you cannot break the connection between human beings. Don't forget it. See you soon, folks. Take care. Stay safe.
An arm appeared from nowhere on the shape, seemingly projected like the PseudoPod of a protozoan.
It's a pseudopod. It's a big foot.
It's all about podcasts these days.